FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Welcome. You are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz. Today is May 29th, 2020. Well, you know, homelessness in New York City and in other cities around the country out of control. There doesn't seem to be the political will or desire to really look for permanent solutions that protect the homeless and protect the public at large. This is a nightmare of incredible proportions if you live in these areas. I've heard stories of San Francisco. They literally laid down boulders on the sidewalk to stop the homeless from sleeping in front of their homes. There must be some solution, and perhaps we can come a little closer to figuring out what those solutions are. You probably know that I've written about it before in my newsletter, and we're really fortunate to have Michael Fischer with us. And Michael's association is the Central Park Civic Association. We welcome you onto the show, Michael. Michael, so I guess the whole pandemic has really brought the homeless situation to the forefront.
It's a national crisis. I mean, it impacts New York City. It impacts California. I mean, those are the 2 states that have it the worst. But it's also New Orleans, Las Vegas, Austin, Texas, and other areas of the country. And, we need to have a summit between the states and the federal government to come up with solutions to this problem.
I couldn't agree with you more. The idea that there's a constitutional right to be homeless, to live on the sidewalk in front of a mansion or in front of, usually they're found in lower income areas and help add to the blight, is just nonsense to me. It doesn't help the homeless, and it sure doesn't help society as a whole. What are some of the solutions you're looking at?
Well, unfortunately, there was a law that was passed that allows the homeless to lay in the streets, and the law basically stipulates that as long as they're not a danger to themselves or other people, that they're permitted to stay in the streets, which I think is a terrible law. It gives, basically what we're saying is you can freeze in the streets, you can die in the streets, you can commit suicide in the streets. It's a terrible thing. And unfortunately, the cities, the politicians of the cities, I speak specifically of New York and California, they're doing absolutely nothing to address the problem. New York has a budget of $3.2 billion, and the more money he gets in his budget, the less he does. The homeless crisis in New York is getting worse and worse. On the West Coast in San Francisco and Los Angeles, it's getting worse and worse. If you've been to San Francisco or you've seen some things on TV, they're building tents all over the place, and they're using drugs, they're defecating in the streets, they're urinating in the streets. It's really bad. And what's really sad about it is that people who have residences there or people who have businesses are being very impacted by it. It's a very unhealthy situation. And we're almost asking for potentially another virus, which is, something we don't want to happen. I know in San Diego a few years back, there was a major hepatitis virus in the homeless community where 500 homeless caught it, and I think about 10 or 20 of them passed away from it. So it's something we don't want to deal with, especially seeing how bad this virus is impacting our country right now.
Oh, for sure. I just remember being in San Francisco a couple of years ago. It wasn't even as bad then as it is now, and just seeing it becoming like the black hole of Calcutta. And the idea that people who are living on the street don't present an imminent danger to themselves and to the community at large is really a misnomer, because there's no other form of behavior they could be engaging in that's putting them at such risk. The homeless are preyed upon by predators. They're really, they can be potentially violent. There was a guy I remember up by Central Park on the west side. He had people had been complaining about him for years. They were complaining about him. And yet they let him run free. I think he finally assaulted somebody or killed them. And finally, they were taking him off the street. The other thing, Michael, is that because they're allowed to be on the street, all homeless will eventually engage in criminal behavior. 25% of our jails are taken up by homeless people. And this is a mental health crisis. It's not because they can't afford the rent's too damn high. It's because of the mental state. The people who become homeless due to economic conditions, what I would call the economic casualties of society, those people don't want to be homeless. They could be helped with jobs and transitional housing, easily get them off the street. But the others are just not going to come off the streets, not going to stop living on the streets until society says they got to be institutionalized.
And what's pretty scary about what you said is that, for example, right now with the coronavirus that's impacting us. I mean, in 3 or 4 months from now, when people maybe who didn't have jobs or lost their jobs and can't afford to pay rent, maybe they become alcoholics or drug addicts, they get thrown out of where they live, they end up on the streets. The cities, whether it's here or on the West Coast, do not provide any types of rehabilitation programs to help them, to get them, rehabilitated, get them back into jobs, and maybe get them into affordable housing. And it's a real dangerous situation. And what's most dangerous about this is we're going to see a huge influx of more and more homeless people on the streets. And until we come up with programs that are going to help these people, it's just going to get worse and worse. Now, what can we do? Well, first of all, in New York, for example, de Blasio has this program called Turn the Tide on the homeless program. It's a disaster. I mean, he's spending $1.2 billion on it. What he's trying to do is rent out 90 shelter buildings in the most expensive areas of the city. These buildings are owned by slumlords. The slumlords are making millions of dollars. They also give donations, obviously, to the politicians. They're hiring these outside companies to manage these shelters. They're making millions of dollars. And the majority of the people don't go into these shelters. A lot of the people that go into the shelters, as you spoke about before, are people who are in prison. They come out, they go into the shelters. But nobody wants to go in the shelters because they're unsafe. And so they stay on the streets. So what we need to do, is between the federal and state government, there's lots of vacant buildings. You have military bases that are empty, lots of buildings you can use that at a less cost. You have empty hospital buildings that used to be hospitals, no longer hospitals, hotels, and so on and so forth. And you go in and you create modern rehabilitation facilities. You create programs, get them in there, get them rehabilitated. If they're an alcoholic, get them rehabilitated. Or if there's somebody who's just mentally ill, needs medications, try to get them on medication. Look, you're not going to help all of them. Some of them don't want to be helped. Some of them are so far off, they're not going to be able to be helped. But at least give them housing where they can stay in a special facility where the cost isn't going to be so much.
Yeah.
And if they do that, we can get a lot of the homeless people off the streets.
Absolutely. Alarming statistic, in the 50s, 550,000 people thereabouts were involuntarily committed to mental hospitals. Now it's 55,000. The population's doubled. The drug epidemic has hit. And probably there's over 1 million of these people who really need to be institutionalized. And yet the trend is away from institutionalization and over to these community centers, treatment centers that just don't exist and never did exist. And the state, I read in San Francisco, it cost $45,000 per homeless person to service them, to give them the services. It includes emergency room visits, which are constant with the homeless. It involves just feeding them. And so if you're paying $45,000 a year for them to live on the street, why not take that $45,000, put them into a therapeutic environment and commit them? And it's so hard to commit mentally ill people to mental institutions now that they don't even bother.
Well, I think they can make these modern facilities a lot, friendlier for people. I think that the old institutions of the 60s and 70s were very, very bad places to be. And, if they're properly run, and maybe you hire private organizations to come in and run them as opposed to government. And if they're privately run, and you rotate. Somebody comes in and runs it, you get rid of them, you bring somebody else in.
Sure.
So these companies don't get too comfortable. They come in, they manage these facilities, and you try to help as many people as you can. But you got to get the people off the streets. It's got to be win-win for the people that have businesses that live on the streets. I mean, for example, Grand Central Station, restaurants all over the place, but people don't want to eat in the restaurants because there's so many homeless people laying around all over the place. So it's hurting their businesses. People who live in communities. I mean, for example, in my building, where I have a residence, you have homeless people that lay all over the place, and they defecate right there at the building, and the police can't do anything. They have their hands tied because the politicians don't want to get involved with it.
Yeah. Well, I argue the politicians like the homeless situation. They like getting more homeless people because it brings more money into the programs that are ineffective, that don't work, but that money gets paid out to their contributors, their donors, and it's become a vicious cycle where actually the Blasio, everything he's doing is actually increasing homelessness rather than decreasing it. And for $3 billion a year, that could house a lot of people in these provisional facilities, treatment facilities.
Absolutely.
And I don't know what we're waiting for. So everyone in New York basically hates your mayor. He was a laughingstock when he ran for president. Talk about a person who's not self-aware. His behavior and his actions during the pandemic have been nothing short of disastrous.
It's been terrible. I mean, the trains. I mean, for months I've been saying either shut the subways down or take the homeless off the subways and don't let them ride the subways. Because you have the homeless people who are more likely to catch the virus. They have very weak immune systems. Mm-hmm. They're all over the place. They go into Starbucks and McDonald's. They're catching it. They go into the subways. They sleep. They touch everything. They sneeze. They cough. And they're passing the virus around. And you have these essential workers trying to get to their jobs, catching the virus as they go. And the numbers in New York and New Jersey are outrageous in terms of not only the number of people that have caught the virus, which I think the numbers that are reported are much lower than there actually are, and the number of people who have died from it, which I think they're much higher numbers. And this is just unacceptable. So what I find interesting is what they decided to do after they got a lot of pressure from groups like our group and other groups, is they decided, well, we'll close the subway down between 1 and 5, and we'll sanitize, we'll make everybody leave, including the homeless, then we'll sanitize the subway. So what happens? They shut them down, they sanitize the subways. Great, we're happy they're doing that. But weren't you sanitizing them before? And then the homeless leave. No. They go into the buses. They sleep in the buses, and then at 5 o'clock they go back on the subways. So what does this accomplish? It accomplishes absolutely nothing.
Yeah, probably de Blasio. He's probably giving them easy passes to get on the Metro cards to get on the subway too, and the buses. Knowing him. That would be his idea of humane.
Well, they have these early release programs where they're letting people out of prison that have, some pretty bad criminal records, and we're finding we're getting a much higher increase in crime, and a lot of these people that are being let out are committing the crimes. It just like a lot of, I think in politics, like when you make decisions, when I make decisions in business, I try to make common sense decisions. Right? You do too.
Sure.
They don't make common sense decisions. It just makes absolutely no sense. Even on the West Coast, he gives everybody $500 a month or 400, whatever it is, 500 or $400 a month. It doesn't make any sense. In the city now, they're putting the homeless into 5-star hotels. It just doesn't make any sense with no rehabilitation. They're putting people who need help, who are crying for help, mentally ill people in these facilities and in hotels. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
To anyone with any sense, but political decisions often aren't based on common sense. They're based on expediency and making problems appear to go away when they're not really. So tell us what the Central Park Civic Association is doing to fight all this.
We're trying to get our message out there loud and clear. I mean, I try to go on as many media outlets as I can. I meet with politicians. One of the things I'm trying to do, right now with the virus, it's a little bit more difficult to do, but I want to set up a meeting between the federal government, the president, his administration, and some of the major states that have a lot of the problems. I'm bringing a lot of experts. Let's sit down. Let's talk about it. Let's figure out a solution. Let's have conversation. There's no conversation that really goes on. A little bit of conversation behind the scenes, but not enough. And what I like to do is really motivate everybody to want to have these conversations, to want to actually do something. Let's help these people. Let's help to dictate helping these people versus letting them dictate to us that they just want to stay on the streets, because they're not in a position to make those decisions.
Oh, for sure. They're not competent. When you're not competent, that means that somebody who is competent has to take charge of your life, either in the form of a conservatorship or guardianship, something to that effect, guardian ad litem. And yet the system has completely failed us all over the country. Just the places you've mentioned more so than others. Seattle, gorgeous city, is just in shambles. And yet,
Portland.
Yeah, Portland. And yet I don't want to get into a political discussion about it, but these are mostly Democratic stronghold cities, and they're one-party rule cities, and this is kind of the natural outgrowth of it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's. I just think we have to work in terms of trying to help these people and not put these people in a situation where they're the victims, they're on the streets, they're laying there ready to die. I mean, that shouldn't be the case. We should try to help these people. And look, there are people that are on the streets that probably maybe don't need a lot of rehabilitation. Get them off the streets, give them some place to live, and give them some kind of a job. It doesn't have to be a high-end job. It could be any kind of a job. Get them working. Get them to want to work. You know, I think people can be rehabilitated. I really do. I don't think the government thinks they can be, but I do. I think you can rehabilitate a lot of these people.
Yeah, well, I don't think until you try, you can make that decision of whether they can be helped or not until you're actually giving them real treatment. You don't know whether they can be helped. Now, obviously, a lot of the addicts, alcoholics have been in and out of programs their whole lives, and it hasn't done anything. So you have to triage them. The ones that can be helped, you have to help. The ones that can't, you have to find humane locations for them. And yeah, we've got all these empty military bases all over the country, and they would be a perfect place to set up and start treating them on a mass level rather than what we have now. So if President Trump were listening to this podcast, which would be a nice thing if he was, what would you tell the president?
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next.
Lumina Gold, ticker symbol LUM on the Toronto Venture and LMGDF on the OTC, is yet another of legendary mining investor Ross Beaty's Lumina Group. It's advancing the largest primary gold deposit in Ecuador. The resource is estimated to contain 16.7 million ounces of gold and 2.2 billion pounds of copper. At just $7 US per ounce gold equivalent, it trades at an incredible 13% of its net present value. More good news is on the way with an updated PEA study expected in Q2 of 2020. It has unparalleled infrastructure. There's grid power to camp with plentiful, inexpensive hydropower available. It's close to 2 ports and is just 8 kilometers from a paved highway. Water is plentiful. It's at low elevation, and the closest community, which is very supportive of Lumina's effort, is just a 7-kilometer ride. With all this going for it, it's likely to follow the typical Ross Beaty formula, which means big returns to shareholders. Find out more and sign up for notifications at luminagold.com. That's Lumina, Lumina gold.com.
The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
I would tell the president, get reelected. Number one. And I would say to him that we need to, when this virus thing lets loose a little bit, we need to get a meeting together with the states and let's try to come up with some ideas together and partner.
And he has been out in front of the issue, basically telling him, you solve the problem, and if you don't, we will. And really, there's a lot of pressure that can be brought. I mean, all these cities are one-party cities. Because the other party has given up on them. But the fact is, the homeless problem is a means for them to propose solutions and break the era of one-party rule in all of these cities, because people who are voting one way their whole lives, the one thing that everybody can agree on, regardless what your political slant, is that the current situation is untenable. It's unbearable, and it needs to be solved. And if leaders start running for office, regardless what their party, and address this problem specifically, to me, Michael, it is the biggest issue in any urban area. You wake up to homelessness, you get home at night, you go to sleep, stepping over people to get into your home. It's really existential too, to the survival and the thriving of these urban centers that really.
And the cities now are filthy. I mean, you walk around New York City, like when Bloomberg was in office, it was spotless. You walk around now, there's garbage all over the place. And, it's just there. I mean, I get the feeling that the homeless are kind of in control of the city and are kind of doing what they want to do. And they're doing things the way they want to do it. And that's it. And, if you don't like it, tough. We have the right to be here and to impact your life the way we want to. And it's got to, like I said earlier, it's got to be win-win. But a lot of these people are crying for help. We need to help them. We need to and not ignore them. Enough of the politics. A lot of it is optics for these politicians. They feel for whatever reason that if they take them off the street, it makes them look bad. I don't understand that logic.
Yeah. Well, your current mayor hasn't been governing by logic or acting through logic at all throughout his entire tenure. And hopefully there will be somebody who emerges in the next go round in the elections who will have solutions and unseat this guy, because it's one thing to think, oh, we'll just, elect this person. How bad could it be? We're now finding out how bad it could be when you elect these people who are incompetent and who have absolutely no ability to manage and to govern. You wind up with the current situation. And what they like to do is always say it's an economic thing. The rent's too high. They can't afford their homes, and that's why they move to the streets. But you and I both know that the vast majority are mentally ill, drug addicted, alcoholic. It's time to put a stop to this. If people want to find out more about the Central Park Civic Association, get involved in it, where do they go?
www.centralparkcivicassociation.com. www.centralparkcivicassociation.com.
All right, and we'll have a link to it in the show notes. Look,
thank you.
If we all rise up here and say no mas, we're not taking this anymore, the politicians will have no choice but to obey and to give countenance to the people's will. And it's too easy to ignore them and just hope that the problem will get better. We know that's not going to happen. Anyways, hey, you got a question for Michael, myself? You have an opinion about homelessness? We want to hear from you. KL@KerryLutz.com. That's the email address, KL@KerryLutz.com. And I'll forward your questions to Michael as well. And visit our website, financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Michael, can't thank you enough for coming on, bringing this to our attention, and our thoughts are with you.
Thank you.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.